Hi, everybody. Brian Norcross here with a video update here this Wednesday, June 11th, on where we stand on hurricane season and the new forecast for the season from Colorado State University. There you see the latest numbers just out today. 17 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 3 category 3 and above. If those sound familiar, that's because those are exactly the same numbers that they put out in April. By June, normally there is more certainty in the forecast, but this year there is a lot of uncertainty because the signals that point in one direction or the other are very weak this year. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But let's compare these numbers to the numbers we already have, the averages, and what happened last year. You notice NOAA that came out with their numbers last month are about the same. They give us a range as opposed to just a single number, but they're all in the same range because the thinking is basically the same. They're all slightly above average. But the average is a 30-year average that goes back to the early 90s, 1991 to 2020. And in the 90s, the technology was not the same. And so we didn't count all the storms that we can count now because we have higher resolution monitoring of the system. So those numbers are probably a little bit low. So bottom line is the thinking is, the consensus is, of NOAA and Colorado State University team there, the team that does this, led by Dr. Phil Klotzbach, is that this will be slightly above normal. And there are many agencies around the world that put out forecasts, and they all basically agree with that. Compare it to last year. Last year, the number of named storms was not so high because we had that big gap in the middle of the season. Remember when nothing happened? But the number of hurricanes was very high considering that we had that gap, and more than our forecast this year because the ocean waters out in the tropical Atlantic were very, very warm, and the Pacific La Nina was in effect, and that encourages more storms. So both those things were going on last year, especially later in the hurricane season. All right, what's going on out there right now, and why is the Atlantic so quiet? Well, it's because high pressure is out there, and boy, is this a strong high pressure system. High pressure is the opposite of the low pressure of tropical systems. So when you have a high, that means that any kind of low pressure systems that might want to develop are displaced by that high. It's kind of like a block or a shield. And so that's happening. If you notice these lines, notice they come all the way over here into the Gulf. So this is why Florida is dry. It's keeping the systems away from Florida, the tropical systems. We are getting some thunderstorm kind of systems here, but those are from disturbances coming from the north, not coming from the south. Matter of fact, the storm track is well displaced to the south. So indeed, there are disturbances coming across, but they're coming across in this low storm track, and they're ending up in the Pacific because they're blocked from the Atlantic by this high pressure, and there's dust out there. So the disturbances that come off of Africa are involved with the dust, and they really can't get going, and they stay weak, and then they end up in the Pacific, whereas we know the conditions are extremely conducive just off of Mexico, and so they're blowing up into storms. In the Pacific, we've already had 3, and we'll probably have 4 here in the immediate future. Meanwhile, high pressure blocking everything in the Atlantic. All right, and then we look at the water temperatures, and the water temperatures out here are quite cool, so nothing in this part of the Atlantic is going to get going. But over here, we have very warm water in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So definitely something could get cranking there. High pressure over the Atlantic. Remember, we were talking about that. That's strong. That's driving cooler water down from the north, relatively cooler water. The water there, remember, is in the upper 70s, and then driving warm water this way, so we end up with this very warm water over here. So this is where we are right now. Now, things are all going to warm up as we get into the summer, but this is where we are right now. And there's one more wrinkle to look at, and that is, let's look at the water temperatures different from normal, looking at that 30-year average from the 90s into the 2010s. And you see this pocket out here is significantly cooler than normal. Now, again, it's going to warm up. The absolute temperature is going to warm up, and it's going to be conducive to having tropical storms and hurricanes here in the next month or so. But it's starting out cooler than normal. But what's happening here? We have a very warm air up in here in what's called the subtropics. So if this is a possibility that we really should just think about for later on in the hurricane season. High pressure here is sinking air. Well, that warm water is rising air, and that might, over time, weaken the high pressure system. If it weakens the high pressure system, then we have lighter winds coming across the Atlantic here. That stirs up less cool water underneath. That tends to warm the Atlantic, and we end up with more conducive conditions later on in the hurricane season. So we'll just keep that in our mind for later on. If it's going to go one direction or the other, you would think it would go to a warmer Atlantic as we move farther downstream. And in the Pacific, now we look in this box south of Hawaii for, is it an El Nino or a La Nina? Remember that the El Nino suppresses Atlantic hurricanes, the La Nina supports Atlantic hurricanes. Right now, it's a little bit cool, but we call this officially neutral between those two, so not having any specific direct effect on the Atlantic. But if it is going to go in any direction, the computer forecasts say it will go, the odds are higher that it will go toward La Nina, supporting more Atlantic hurricanes later in the season. So if we had to put odds on it, and this is what we're here to do here today, is we'd say that the later in the season will be busier, and there is a possibility of the conditions becoming more conducive than they look right now. So if those numbers were going to change, they would change for the higher, we would think, at this point. So here are the takeaways from the CSU forecast. If anything happens, the indications are it will be a warmer Atlantic, and the Atlantic is going to warm. There's no question about that. The question is, does it warm to something above normal? It's close to normal to slightly cool in some areas now. Indications are La Nina could develop. In other words, the odds are higher it will develop and be more supportive of tropical storms and hurricanes than go the other way and be an El Nino, and that would squash the development. So if it goes one way or the other, it goes to supportive, but the signals are weak. When signals are weak, then we have less certainty. So that's the bottom line. Higher forecast uncertainty than normal this year because of those weak signals of exactly what's going to happen. But the bottom line is we're very good for June. Sometimes we don't have any tropical storms in June or even July. But I hasten to remind you of 2004. I remember that was the year that 4 hurricanes impacted Florida, and it was a crazy year. That year, the first tropical named system was August 9th. And then the switch flipped on, and it was continuous on into October. So it happens that they start late and then go gangbusters. So just because we're having a good June doesn't indicate what's going to happen later on in the year. In fact, there is no correlation between what happens in June and what happens later on. All right, so for now, it's a good time to be thinking about your hurricane season plans and get yourself ready for whatever comes, because as we always say, it only takes one. All right, take care.